I'd known that my neighbor Karen was nosy since the day she moved into the neighborhood, but until then, she'd only done the classic annoyances of someone who thinks she's in charge of the community. She complained about the colors of the fences, the height of the grass, the sound of children laughing in the street. It was a warm afternoon. The bees were buzzing happily in my apiary, and I was extracting some honey to bottle. Nothing more peaceful, right? Wrong. Out of nowhere, I heard the sound of determined footsteps on the gravel of my driveway. It was her. You know when someone arrives huffing and puffing, as if they were carrying the revolt of entire generations of neighborhood controllers? That's right. The woman stopped at the edge of my property, crossed her arms, and made that expression that only those who have had a Karen HOA in their lives recognize. This thing you're doing. It's not fair. What do you mean? I asked, already knowing that any answer would lead to more drama than a Mexican soap opera. The rules of our community are very clear when it comes to natural resources, she said, slurring her words as if she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. And this honey should be shared. What do you want? A community honey-sharing program? I asked, sarcastically. She didn't even blink. Exactly. You got it. I took a deep breath. You know that moment when you feel your brain frying because someone else's stupidity has gone beyond what you thought possible. But the woman was determined. Did you know that there are studies showing that bees are essential for the environment? She continued, now with that expression of a university professor explaining the obvious to a bunch of freshmen. Yes, of course, because I raised them. So you must understand that you can't monopolize something so important. There you go. Now I was no longer a simple beekeeper. I was a honey tyrant, an oppressor of the bees, a tycoon exploiting the natural wealth of the neighborhood. I tried to argue. I explained that it was a hobby, that I invested time and money in it, that the hives were on my land, and, most importantly, that there were no HOA rules about apiaries. But the woman didn't want to hear it. She had already decided that she was the heroine of a battle against a neighborhood villain. I was the dragon sleeping on a mountain of golden, sticky gold. And she was the brave warrior who would bring justice to the poor citizens deprived of the sacred nectar. When she realized that she wasn't going to be able to convince me in the conversation, she unleashed her final card. Then I'll have to take this matter to the HOA board. I let out a nasal laugh because, frankly, the situation was so ridiculous that I couldn't even take it seriously. Good luck with that, I replied. She gave me a deadly look before turning on her heels and marching off, probably already planning an emergency meeting with the other soldiers of the dictatorship of good taste. But, as I would soon discover, the woman wasn't going to wait for an official decision. No, she had a plan of her own, and it involved theft and many, many bee stings. What should I have done after that conversation? Maybe installed cameras. Maybe put up a giant sign saying, "Please do not touch the hives unless you want a free plaster via stings." But no, I underestimated that woman's level of insanity. I thought she would just send a few angry emails to the HOA and eventually move on to her next battle against the neighborhood. I was wrong. Very wrong. The next morning, I went to the market to buy some bottles to store my honey. When I came back, something in my yard seemed different. A strange kind of silence. That silence that precedes chaos. And then I saw it. A clumsy figure, covered from head to toe in one of those beekeeper suits you buy on Amazon, rummaging through the hives as if ransacking a sacred temple. It was her, the woman, the creature, the insufferable ruler of the HOA, trying to steal my honey, right there, in the middle of the day, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to process it. I knew she was crazy, but I never thought it would get to that level. It's just that the universe, my dear chaotic friend, has a wonderful way of resolving certain injustices without us having to lift a finger. She opened the lid of the hive, and it was at that very moment that her free biology lessons began. First came the buzzing, loud, furious, a symphony of pure natural revenge. Then came the first sting, then the second, the third, the fourth went straight into her hand. And then, my friend, the show really began. The woman let out a scream I'd only heard before in horror movies. She tried to take a step back, but tripped over her own foot, knocking half the hive to the floor. This was the equivalent of kicking a giant anthill and expecting the ants to simply say, "Oh, relax, you can mess with our house." The bees weren't happy at all. They came out in such a ferocious swarm that for a moment, the air seemed to vibrate. I saw the woman run, her arms waving in the air as if she were trying to cast spells to drive them away. But no spell could save her. The bees were bad. She tripped again, this time hitting her face straight into the ground. Should I have helped? Maybe I should have. But honestly, I was too busy holding in my laughter to move. Then came the scene that would forever be etched in my memory. She stumbled to her feet, still covered in bees, and ran out into the street, screaming as if she were being chased by the devil himself. And that's when something else happened. A car was coming, one of those expensive SUVs, probably owned by a neighbor who didn't expect to find a woman covered in insects running towards him like a lab escapee. The driver slammed on the brakes, and the woman, unable to stop in time, simply threw herself onto the hood of the car, desperately trying to get rid of the bees that were still stuck to her. The driver, of course, freaked out. The car accelerated half a meter, then braked again. The woman was thrown backwards, fell on her butt on the asphalt, and started rolling on the ground, trying to crush the bees against her body, as if she were having an epileptic fit. Finally, the poor insects decided they'd had enough and began to scatter. From my backyard, I watched as if I were watching the best comedy ever produced in the history of mankind. Then, the unthinkable happened. The woman stood up, staggering, her face swollen, her arms covered in bites, and her pride completely destroyed, and looked straight at me. She pointed a trembling finger in my direction, and, in a voice hoarse from screaming, she unleashed her sentence. "You will pay for this." And then, with no strength left to continue her crusade against nature, she turned on her heels and limped home, looking more like a zombie movie character than a real person. I stood there, laughing so hard that my stomach almost cramped. Only, at that moment, I should have prepared myself, because the woman, though defeated, hadn't given up yet. She couldn't accept losing, and her real revenge was just beginning. If the story had ended with Karen running down the street covered in bees and her swollen face looking like a malformed tomato, it would have been a beautiful ending. Poetic even. But no, because some people just don't know when to accept defeat. I should have predicted that she wouldn't stay quiet after the honey disaster. I should have prepared myself for some kind of retaliation, like a formal complaint to the HOA or an attempt to pass a bizarre rule banning beehives in the neighborhood. But Karen wasn't the type to play fair. 2 days after the bee attack, I woke up to a strange noise in my backyard. It wasn't buzzing, it wasn't wind, it wasn't a raccoon trying to steal something. It was something worse, the sound of a truck engine. I opened the back door and, to my surprise, saw no less than 3 men in orange uniforms dismantling my apiary. They were lifting the hives with thick gloves, putting them in wooden boxes, and loading everything into a white truck. I was paralyzed for a second. It couldn't be real. I marched out to them, my heart already pounding in my chest. "What the fuck are you doing?" The 3 of them stopped for a second and looked at each other. One of them, a guy with a beer belly and a sweaty cap, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and replied with the world's biggest scowl. "Order of the HOA. They said these hives were so irregular." The HOA? Of course. I wanted to laugh. The woman had really tried to rip me off, had been beaten up by bees, and now wanted to take revenge by forcibly confiscating my apiary. Irregular hives, eh? I crossed my arms, feeling my blood boil. "Do you have an official document for this? Any proof that this was approved?" The man blinked a few times, not knowing exactly how to answer. He looked at his colleagues, and then at a ridiculously crumpled piece of paper in his hand. "Here it is," he said, handing me the document. I took the paper, and, without even having to read much, I started laughing. That wasn't an official notice from the HOA. It was a sheet of paper printed in Arial font size 14, signed by Karen herself. And the best part? No stamp, nothing. Just a scribble at the bottom saying, "Sincerely, HOA Karen." This woman's audacity knew no bounds. Mate, the crumpling the sheet in front of him. The guy seemed to hesitate. So did his colleagues. They clearly weren't in the mood to stick their hands in the house of marimbondos, either literally or figuratively. "And here's the thing," I continued, pointing at the truck. "If you don't return these hives to their place now, I'm going to call the police, and you're going to explain very clearly why you're trespassing on private property with a false order." The threat took effect. The man let out an exhausted sigh, muttered, "I don't get paid enough for this," and ordered his colleagues to put the hives back. But I wasn't finished yet. I took out my cell phone and started recording. "Now do me a favor, buddy," I said, while pointing the camera at him. "Tell the camera who sent you here." The guy's eyes widened, realizing he'd got himself into a bigger problem than he'd expected. "Oh, it was the HOA. Who from the HOA?" He swallowed. He scratched his head. He looked around, as if hoping to find a hole to stick his face in. It was Mrs. Karen. "That's perfect." I smiled and stopped the recording. Now I had beautiful, wonderful proof that the woman had tried to have my apiary illegally removed. But the funniest thing was yet to come. That same day, I took the video and went to the HOA headquarters. They had a small office in the neighborhood, a little white house with a fancy sign that said, "Community Association, striving for order." I walked in without knocking and went straight up to the secretary, a woman in her 50s with slicked-back hair and a face that looked like she'd had enough of existing. "I need to speak to whoever the head of the HOA is." She didn't even blink. "That would be Karen." Great. Karen was in a little room in the back, probably planning her next attempt to turn the neighborhood into a concentration camp of rules. When I walked in without being asked, she looked at me like I was an alien. "You can't just barge in here like that," she shouted. "Funny, isn't it? Because you seem to think you can just walk onto my land and take my stuff." She opened her mouth to retort, but before she could say anything, I took out my cell phone and pressed play on the video. The room fell silent. Karen watched the man admit that it was she who sent him to invade my property. She watched as the ridiculous sheet of paper she tried to pass off as an official document was completely exposed. And then, for the first time since this war began, she paled. That doesn't prove anything," she tried to say, her voice a little shaky. "Proof enough for me to file a nice defamation and trespass suit. I'm not a lawyer, but neither was Karen, and she didn't need to know that I was bluffing." Then something happened that surprised me. The vice president of the HOA, a gray-haired man I'd never seen before, was sitting in the corner of the room, watching everything without saying a word, until he sniffed, stood up slowly, and said, "Karen, did you sign that order yourself, without the council's approval?" She opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. "Minus I was just taking the initiative for the good of the community." The man sighed, shaking his head. "This is a violation of our guidelines. You can't make decisions of this level without approval." And then, as if karma was just waiting for the right moment to deliver the final blow, he picked up a form from the table and said calmly, "I'm going to need you to sign this. Formal request to resign from the HOA." Karen turned red, then white, then red again. "You can't do this to me." "I can and I will," he said. And so, in a single movement, Karen was dethroned. I just smiled, put my cell phone in my pocket, and left the room. Now, finally, she was finished. Or so I thought. Karen was out of the HOA, expelled, humiliated, literally kicked out of the very fortress of regulations and forms that she loved so much. If it had been anyone else, this would have been the moment to back down, to accept defeat, with a modicum of dignity, and move on. But Karen? Oh, Karen was the type who, if she was falling off a cliff, would still try to pull someone along. The question was, what else could she do? Well, I'd find out in less than 48 hours. The day after her eviction, I was quietly tending to my hives when I heard a knock on the front door. This time, it wasn't Karen. It was two men in suits, with badges on their chests, their faces unfriendly, and a notebook in their hands. "Are you in charge of this property?" My instincts went red. "Yes, I am." "Is there a problem?" The tallest of them snorted and opened a clipboard. "We have received a complaint that you are conducting illegal food production and sales activities without a proper license." I blinked. "What?" "According to the complaint," he continued, ignoring my indignation, "you are producing and distributing honey without certification, which could pose a health risk to the community." That's when I found out. Karen. It had to be her. It was as obvious as the sun rising in the morning. The woman, desperate to get to me, called the health inspectorate and made up an absurd story. "Well, this isn't a commercial production," I explained, crossing my arms. "I don't sell honey. It's a hobby. Everything I produce is for my own consumption, or as a gift for friends." The other inspector looked at me suspiciously. "Are you sure about that?" I took a deep breath. "Absolutely. But please, feel free to check." I accompanied them to the apiary, letting them analyze everything they wanted. They checked the hives, inspected the area, and even asked a few questions about how I stored the honey. In the end, the verdict was exactly what I expected. "We didn't find any irregularities," said the inspector, closing his clipboard. "It seems we received an unfounded complaint." I looked surprised. Wow, who would do something so childish? They both looked at each other, but didn't say anything. They dealt with this kind of thing before. Then, before they left, one of them looked at me and commented, "But I must warn you, the person who made the complaint was very insistent." I smiled. I bet he was. After that fiasco, I knew that Karen must have been eating her own liver with rage. She tried to steal from me. She tried to hurt me with the HOA. She tried to call the health inspectorate, and nothing worked. But I wanted to make sure she never even looked in the direction of my yard again. So, I had an idea. If Karen wanted to mess with my bees so badly, they could become the last permanent reminder of her in this neighborhood. I waited for a sunny Saturday, a beautiful day, perfect for gardening. Why? Because I knew that Karen usually went out to take care of the yard and make her imaginary inspections of the neighborhood at that time. I picked up a small bottle of queen bee pheromone, a substance used to attract and calm swarms. A harmless little thing sold in any beekeeping store. I walked around the neighborhood and discreetly sprinkled a little of the liquid on the bushes near her house. Just a few drops, just enough to attract attention. And then I waited. 2 hours later, it happened. A whole cloud of bees began to circle in front of Karen's house. It wasn't an aggressive swarm, far from it. But for someone who had recently been traumatized by bees, it must have seemed like the apocalypse itself. And then, just as I expected, she came out of the house to collect the mail, in a white t-shirt. And that's when the comic tragedy unfolded. She took 2 steps outside and noticed the buzzing. She froze. I swear I saw her eyes go wide with absolute terror when she noticed the swarm flying right by her balcony. That's when she went into absolute panic mode. First, she tried to run into the house, but in her haste, she tripped over her own entrance mat and fell to her knees. Then she started flailing around like a post puppet, trying to ward off the bees that weren't even attacking. And then, the icing on the cake. She grabbed the garden hose and tried to spray herself all over. Do you know what happens when you do that around bees? They think it's raining. And what do bees do when it starts to rain? They fly under any covered structure, which, in this case, was Karen's balcony. The result, in less than 5 seconds, a dozen bees were stuck to her shirt, and she absolutely collapsed. The woman started running around the yard, trying to get rid of the imaginary insects, while half the neighborhood watched. A neighbor from across the street came out onto the sidewalk, coffee in hand, watching the scene as if it were a live TV show. Even one of the neighbor's dogs stopped in the middle of the street and stared as if he couldn't believe his eyes. What about me? Well, I just leaned against my fence, arms crossed, watching everything with a slight smile on my face. When he finally managed to lock himself inside, I heard one last hysterical scream from inside. "I can't stand this place any longer." And then, the next day, she put the house up for sale. It wasn't long before Karen was out of there. After everything that had happened, her reputation was destroyed. The HOA pretended it had never met her. The neighbors stopped talking to her. No one wanted to be associated with the crazy woman who tried to rob an apiary and ended up sworn to death by an army of bees. And what about me? Well, I carried on living my life, enjoying the peace and quiet, and, of course, producing the yummiest honey in the neighborhood. Did you like this video? Then don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more.